They saw an old black veteran standing too long at a war monument and decided he didn't belong. So they humiliated Elias Carter in broad daylight, slamming him against the stone built to honor the very men he once bled beside. But what the officers didn't know was that Elias had returned to prove 3 forgotten black soldiers were denied their medals by the same city now calling him suspicious. By the next morning, the courtroom, city hall, and every news station in Georgia would be forced to watch the footage of the man they called a threat, and realize they had brutalized the soldier who came back to restore someone else's honor. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Early November settled over Savannah, Georgia, with a soft gray sky and a thin ribbon of coastal fog drifting between the old brick buildings near the historic district. The air carried the scent of damp oak bark and salt from the river, while a cold breeze stirred the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient trees around Liberty Square. By 7 in the morning, the city was only half awake. Delivery trucks humming in the distance, cafe lights warming up the sidewalks, and the old war memorial standing silent at the heart of the square like a stone witness to a century of memory. At the edge of the historic district, tucked between a shuttered antique store and a narrow diner, stood the Magnolia Rest Inn, a modest 2-story boarding house with chipped white paint and green shutters faded by the Georgia sun. That was where Elias Carter stayed. Elias Carter was a 68-year-old African-American Army veteran, tall even in age, though the years had bent his shoulders just enough to show the weight of memory. His frame was lean and disciplined, the kind built by decades of routine rather than vanity. Deep brown skin lined with quiet age marked a face that had learned how to survive silence. His silver-gray hair was cropped close in the same military style he had worn since his 20s, and a faint scar near his left temple disappeared into the short curls above his ear. His dark brown eyes remained steady, observant, and almost unsettling in their calm, as if nothing in the world moved faster than his mind could measure. He had the habit of rising at 5:30 every morning, folding his blanket with perfect corners, polishing his old brown boots until they reflected the yellow motel lamp, and aligning every item on the nightstand in straight angles: wallet, watch, reading glasses, notebook, camera. War had left him with habits no peace could erase. The small room itself reflected him, neat, sparse, precise. A single bed, a narrow desk, a Bible in the drawer, 2 sharpened pencils beside a weathered leather notebook, whose edges had softened from years of use. That notebook mattered more than anything else in the room. Inside it were names of men the world no longer remembered. By 7:15, Elias stepped out into the Savannah morning wearing a weathered brown coat over a pressed charcoal sweater, dark slacks, and the polished boots that struck the sidewalk with a measured rhythm. In one hand, he carried a compact camera. In the other, the notebook. Every morning, he walked the same route, past the bakery on Whitaker Street, across the brick path lined with old live oaks, then into Liberty Square War Memorial, where the monument rose from white marble steps beneath 3 towering flags. The memorial itself was beautiful, in the kind of way only old grief could be. Bronze soldiers stood frozen in forward motion, rifles lifted toward a sky that had forgotten their war. Around the base, names were carved into black granite panels, hundreds of them, arranged by regiment and year. Elias approached the eastern panel first. His fingers, rough and deliberate, moved over the engraved names. Then he stopped. There it was again, a section near the lower left corner where the lettering had been recut during some past restoration. The font shifted slightly. The spacing was wrong. 3 names that should have been there were missing. He opened the notebook. Each page was filled with careful handwriting. Dates, regiments, service numbers, fragments of military reports, names of the dead. At the center of all of it was the 214th Support Battalion, an all-black logistics unit that had served in Kuwait during the Gulf War. Their convoy had been ambushed. 7 men survived because one staff sergeant disobeyed direct orders and drove back into artillery fire. That staff sergeant was Elias. But this wasn't about him. It was about the three men whose names had disappeared from the stone: Terrence Hall, Maurice Green, Leon Bishop. He touched the blank stretch of granite where Leon's name should have been. "Still gone," he murmured. A few feet away, the sound of bicycle tires clicking over brick echoed across the square. That was Noah Price. Noah was a 14-year-old white newspaper delivery boy, lanky and still growing too fast for his own limbs. He had sandy blonde hair that never stayed flat no matter how much water he used, pale freckled skin, and wide blue eyes that held the permanent curiosity of a boy who noticed everything adults forgot. He wore a red hoodie under a delivery satchel almost too large for his thin shoulders, and his sneakers were always half untied. Noah had seen the old veteran every morning for nearly a week now. The thing that struck him most was not Elias's silence. It was the way the old man always touched the same missing place on the stone, like he was checking whether history had finally decided to tell the truth. "Morning, sir," Noah said, slowing his bike. Elias turned with the faintest smile. "Morning." Noah hesitated. "You knew them?" Elias looked back at the wall. "I knew the kind of men they were." There was something in his voice that made Noah straighten. The boy had grown up hearing stories from his grandmother, Helen Price, about soldiers who came home different, about men who carried ghosts in silence because the world liked its heroes quiet. Elias reminded him of those stories. Mysterious, yes, but kind. Noah nodded slowly and rode off, though he glanced back twice before disappearing around the square. Across town, inside the climate-controlled archives wing of the Savannah Historical Museum, another thread of the same story was quietly beginning. Lena Brooks adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to the yellowed military ledger beneath the desk lamp. Lena was a 34-year-old African-American museum archivist, medium height with a slim, composed build and warm brown skin. She wore her tightly coiled black hair in a professional low bun, and her oval face carried the thoughtful seriousness of someone who spent more time with documents than with people. Her dark eyes were sharp, patient, and almost forensic in the way they studied details. Lena had always been gentle with people, but relentless with records. Her father, once a city clerk, had taught her as a child that history is not what happened. It is what people choose to preserve. That lesson had shaped her life. This morning, she had been assigned what should have been a routine cataloging task. Old city correspondence related to war memorial restorations. Instead, she found something strange. A maintenance report from 1998. 3 names had been listed for stone repair. Yet, in the final approved engraving sheet, those same names had been removed. Not faded, not damaged, removed. And beside the revision was a signature line rewritten in darker ink. Someone had changed the record. Lena sat back, pulse quickening. This was no clerical error. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away at the Savannah Herald, Claire Bennett was discovering how boredom sometimes disguised destiny. Claire was a 27-year-old investigative reporter, tall and slender with fair skin, chestnut brown shoulder-length hair, and intelligent green eyes sharpened by ambition. Her style was practical: cream blouse, dark blazer, notebook always tucked under one arm. But there was a nervous energy in the way she tapped her pen against her chin whenever editors underestimated her, which happened often. This morning, her editor slid a thin file across the desk. "Budget cuts on historic preservation," he said. "Liberty Square Memorial restoration delays. Dry stuff, but City Hall wants coverage." Claire exhaled through her nose. It sounded painfully dull. Stone maintenance, funding cuts, municipal excuses. Still, she took the file. Because Claire had learned something after 3 years in local journalism. The stories everyone calls boring are usually the ones hiding the biggest lies. By late morning, she stood near Liberty Square with a camera crew photographer scanning the monument. That was when she noticed him. An elderly black veteran standing perfectly still before the eastern wall, notebook in hand, touching one empty stretch of stone like it mattered more than the flags above him. Claire raised her pen. Interesting. Around the square, a few residents had started noticing him too. A middle-aged woman walking her terrier slowed. A businessman exiting the bank glanced twice. Two tourists whispered. The city had begun to do what cities too often do to quiet black men in public spaces: wonder why they are there. Elias felt the eyes before he saw them, but he did not move. Instead, he wrote one final line beneath Leon Bishop's name. Name removed after 1998 restoration. Must verify city authorization. Possible intentional omission. The wind shifted. Leaves scraped across the marble steps. Above him, the flags cracked sharply in the November air. Savannah was beginning to wake fully now. And somewhere beneath the sound of traffic, printing presses and museum drawers opening, 3 separate lives. Noah's curiosity, Claire's investigation, and Lena's archival discovery had already started moving toward the same truth. A truth carved first in stone, then erased. And now, finally, beginning to return. Elias closed the notebook and looked once more at the missing names. This city had forgotten them, but he had not crossed half a lifetime just to let memory die quietly. Tomorrow, he would come back. And tomorrow, more eyes would be waiting. The next morning, Savannah woke beneath a brighter sky. The coastal fog burned away by pale November sunlight that spilled across the old brick streets and polished the marble of Liberty Square War Memorial in silver-white light. Tourists had already begun drifting through the historic district with paper coffee cups and cameras hanging from their necks. A horse carriage rolled slowly along the far side of the square, its wheels clicking softly over stone. Above it all, the flags over the memorial snapped sharply in the cold breeze, their shadows sliding over the engraved names like restless ghosts. Elias Carter arrived at the square at the same hour as always. Routine had become his armor. His polished boots carried him up the eastern steps, and once again his gloved fingers moved directly to the same section of black granite where Terence Hall, Maurice Green, and Leon Bishop should have stood immortalized in stone. He had spent half the night in the small desk chair at the Magnolia Rest Inn, comparing his handwritten field notes with the fragments of old military correspondence he had memorized years ago. The conclusion had only hardened in his mind. The names had not faded naturally. They had been removed. Today, he came with a new purpose. He lifted his compact camera and photographed the recut lettering from 3 angles, carefully adjusting the focus to capture the uneven depth of the engraving. Then he opened the weathered leather notebook and wrote beneath yesterday's entry, "Stone replacement visible under morning light. Modern cut pattern inconsistent with 1991 original installation." Across the square, inside the outdoor seating area of Magnolia Brew House, someone was watching him. That someone was Marianne Doyle. Marianne was a 56-year-old white woman, tall and sharply dressed even for a casual morning, with a narrow build, pale skin and ash-blonde hair swept into a flawless twist at the back of her head. Her features were elegant but severe. Thin lips, pointed cheekbones, and steel-blue eyes that carried the permanent squint of someone used to judging a room within seconds. She wore a tailored beige coat, pearl earrings, and leather gloves despite the mild cold. As vice chair of the Liberty Square Preservation Society, Marianne had spent 15 years protecting the neighborhood's image with almost obsessive devotion. Years earlier, her late husband's antique store had nearly gone bankrupt after a vandalism scare in the district, an event that had hardened her into someone who saw unfamiliar people as potential threats before they had the chance to become neighbors. This old habit had slowly become prejudice. Now, through the cafe window, she saw the same elderly black man again. Same coat, same notebook, same lingering silence before the monument. Her jaw tightened. "He's been here every day," she muttered, half to herself and half to the barista refilling her coffee. The barista, too busy steaming milk, gave only a distracted nod. Marianne kept watching. To her, Elias's stillness didn't read as grief. It read as surveillance. His camera did not look respectful. It looked suspicious. The longer he remained at the same panel, the more certain she became that something was wrong. Without taking her eyes off him, she pulled out her phone and dialed. "Hello, yes," she said crisply. "There's an elderly man at Liberty Square again. Same one from yesterday. He's taking close-up photos of the memorial and writing in some kind of journal. He's been standing there for over an hour." Her voice dropped lower. "I think he may be planning something." 20 minutes later, a patrol cruiser rolled to the curb beside the square. From the driver's side stepped Officer Cole Mercer. Cole Mercer was a 41-year-old white police officer, broad-shouldered and physically imposing, with close-cropped sandy hair touched by gray at the temples. His square jaw, pale skin, and permanently narrowed gray eyes gave him a stern expression even when silent. Years on the force had shaped him into a man who valued compliance over understanding. He was known for being efficient, disciplined, and respected by older officers. But those same qualities often hardened into arrogance. A controversial neighborhood break-in case years earlier, where hesitation had allowed the suspect to escape, had left Mercer with a deep personal belief that suspicion should always come before trust. From the passenger side emerged Officer Riley Shaw. Riley was a 26-year-old mixed-race female officer, medium height with an athletic, compact frame and warm, olive-brown skin. Her dark curly hair was secured in a regulation bun beneath her cap, and her hazel eyes carried a quiet alertness that had not yet been worn down by cynicism. She had been on the force less than a year, still new enough to believe procedure mattered, and old enough to understand how dangerous it was to question a senior partner too early. Mercer's gaze locked on Elias immediately. "There he is." Riley followed his line of sight. The first thing she noticed was not the camera. It was the small, bronze veteran's pin fastened neatly to the lapel of Elias's coat, a simple insignia of crossed rifles and a service ribbon. He's military, she thought, but Mercer was already moving. Elias heard the footsteps before the shadow crossed the page of his notebook. He turned calmly. Officer Mercer stopped 2 feet away, hands resting near his belt. "Sir," he said, voice clipped, "what exactly are you doing here?" Elias closed the notebook slowly but did not pocket it. "Reviewing names." Mercer glanced at the camera. "You've been here several mornings." "That's right." "Why?" Elias's face remained unreadably calm. "Because the names don't match the records." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "What records?" "My records." The answer seemed to irritate him. Riley stepped slightly to the side, taking in the monument, the notebook, the man's steady posture. Nothing about Elias looked threatening. His hands were visible. His voice was even. His shoulders carried grief, not aggression. But Mercer leaned closer. "Let me see some identification." Elias nodded once and reached carefully into his inner coat pocket, withdrawing his wallet with deliberate slowness. Inside was his Georgia State ID, his veteran service card, and an old military photo folded into the side sleeve. Mercer looked at the ID only briefly before returning his attention to the notebook. "What's in there?" "Names of soldiers." Mercer extended a hand. "I'll need to inspect it." Riley's pulse ticked upward. That wasn't standard, not without cause. Elias met Mercer's stare with the same stillness he had once used under mortar fire. "With respect, officer, this is personal research." Mercer's expression hardened. "Research into what?" "The men this city forgot." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Nearby, tourists had begun slowing. A family from Ohio paused beside the fountain. A couple holding shopping bags whispered. The square, alive with movement only minutes before, now carried the tight stillness of public attention. At the far sidewalk, Claire Bennett had just stepped out of a rideshare with her camera bag slung over one shoulder. She froze when she recognized Elias. And the patrol car. Instinct sharpened instantly. Claire opened her notebook and, without approaching too close, began jotting details. Liberty Square, 10:42 a.m. Officers Mercer plus Shaw. Elderly black veteran questioned at memorial. Something about the posture of the exchange bothered her. This was no casual welfare check. Mercer was too rigid. Elias too composed, the crowd too aware. Across the square, Noah Price had also returned, balancing his bike with one foot on the curb. His old flip-style smartphone, cracked in one corner but still functional, peeked out from his hoodie pocket. He watched Mercer's body language. The officer kept stepping into Elias's space, like he was trying to make calmness look guilty. Noah quietly pulled out the phone and snapped a grainy photo from a distance. Riley saw it happen. Her gaze shifted back to Elias, then to the bronze veteran's pin again. He's standing in front of missing names, she thought. Why does that feel more important than what we're doing? Mercer's tone sharpened. Sir, people in this neighborhood are concerned. You've been lingering around a public monument with a camera and a notebook. That makes people nervous. Elias's expression changed only slightly, a flicker of something deeper than frustration. Standing beside history should not make anyone nervous. Riley felt the truth of that sentence hit harder than it should. Mercer, however, heard defiance. Are you refusing cooperation? Elias kept both hands visible at chest height. I have answered every question. I'm standing on public property. I am documenting names that should be here. Mercer's gaze followed Elias's hand toward the blank section of granite. For the first time, Riley noticed it too, a gap in the order. A spacing issue. 3 lines missing. Before she could speak, Mercer stepped closer. Sir, you've stayed here long enough. The words landed with quiet menace. And around them, beneath the flags and the eyes of strangers, the square itself seemed to hold its breath. Claire wrote faster. Noah gripped his phone tighter. Riley stayed silent. And Elias Carter, the old soldier who had crossed half a lifetime to return forgotten names to stone, realized the city had begun to look at him not as a witness, but as a threat. The silence in Liberty Square tightened the moment Officer Mercer's hand moved to his radio. The flags above the memorial cracked in the November wind, and the small crowd that had gathered around the questioning seemed to sense the shift before anyone spoke. Elias Carter remained where he was, shoulders square, hands visible, the worn leather notebook still resting against his palm like something alive. Across the square, Claire Bennett stopped writing for half a breath. Noah Price lowered his cracked phone just enough to listen, and Riley Shaw's unease sharpened into something heavier. Mercer pressed the radio button clipped near his shoulder. Need a supervisor at Liberty Square. Elderly male, possible suspicious surveillance activity at the memorial. Uncooperative with notebook inspection. The wording alone made Riley glance sideways. Uncooperative? Elias had done nothing but answer calmly, but Mercer had already framed the moment. Within minutes, a second patrol SUV rolled up beside the square. Out stepped Sergeant Daniel Hurst. Hurst was a 52-year-old white supervising officer, thick-set and solid with a heavy neck, broad chest, and the kind of presence that made younger officers instinctively stand straighter. His once black hair had faded to iron gray, clipped short in regulation style, and his pale face was weathered by years of command, with deep lines around the mouth that gave him a permanent expression of impatience. His dark eyes rarely lingered on nuance. Years in internal discipline had trained him to trust the officer's version first and ask questions later. A violent protest incident early in his career, where hesitation had nearly cost one of his men his life, had left him permanently biased toward control over context. He approached the monument with brisk, irritated steps. What's the issue? Mercer gestured toward Elias. Same man as yesterday and this morning. Photographing the monument, documenting names, refuses to let us inspect his journal. Elias spoke before Mercer could shape the story any further. I have identified myself. I am on public property. I am documenting missing names on a war memorial. Hurst barely looked at him. Instead, his eyes landed on the notebook. That the journal? Elias tightened his fingers around the leather cover. It contains names of dead soldiers. Hurst stepped forward and extended a thick hand. Then hand it over so we can verify what kind of notes you're taking around a sensitive city monument. The phrase sensitive city monument made Claire's pen freeze. That was not a legal category. It was a narrative. Elias's voice remained low and even. With respect, Sergeant, there is no lawful basis to seize personal notes from a public visitor. For a moment, the wind was the only sound. Then Hurst's patience snapped. "Take it." Mercer moved first. His hand shot forward, grabbing the notebook before Riley could even process the escalation. The leather slipped from Elias's grip, and for the first time, something changed in the old veteran's face. Not fear, not anger, but something deeper. Loss. Because that notebook was more than notes. It was a paper memorial. A graveyard built from handwriting. Each page held names, dates, memories, fragments of voices, the record of men whose stone memorials had already betrayed them once. Mercer shoved the notebook into a clear evidence bag pulled from his cruiser. The plastic crinkled loudly in the cold air. Claire wrote every movement. Noah stared in disbelief. Riley's chest tightened. Elias looked at the bag as if he had just watched someone remove flowers from a grave. Hurst's tone turned procedural, but only on the surface. "Mr. Carter, we need you to come with us so we can verify your identity and determine your purpose for repeated appearances in this area." "My identity has already been verified. Then this won't take long." It was not a request. Elias understood that immediately. The old instincts returned. Battlefield triage of danger, consequence, and timing. Resist now, and they would justify worse, comply, and the truth would have witnesses. He nodded once. "I'll come voluntarily." Across the square, Claire underlined the words "voluntarily" under visible pressure. Noah slipped his phone back into his hoodie, but the image of the notebook in the evidence bag had already burned into him. As Elias was guided toward the SUV, Riley noticed something she had missed before. Several tourists had begun photographing the scene. Public attention was spreading faster than Mercer realized. At the station, Elias was placed in a narrow interview room with gray walls, a bolted steel table, and fluorescent lights that hummed overhead with a sterile indifference. He sat perfectly upright, hands folded, feet planted, back straight. His breathing remained steady, measured in the same silent cadence he had once used while waiting for mortar impacts in Kuwait. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out. Military calm was no longer discipline. It was survival. Through the mirrored glass, Mercer and Hurst reviewed his ID and veteran card. "No priors," Mercer muttered. "Service record clean?" Hurst added. "Honorable discharge." "So why keep coming back?" Neither man asked the question with curiosity, only suspicion. Meanwhile, Riley stood in the records bay, pretending to organize paperwork while reading the partial intake notes. Every detail about Elias pointed toward dignity, not danger. Veteran. No criminal history, public memorial, missing names. This should have ended in the square. Instead, the hours dragged. No formal charge, no clear accusation, only delay. Back across town, the parallel threads tightened. At the Savannah Historical Museum, Lena Brooks sat hunched over a digitized microfilm reader, the glow of the screen reflecting in her glasses. Her search had moved beyond the 1998 restoration records into archived military ceremony photos tied to Liberty Square dedications. That was when she found it. A faded photograph from Veterans Day, 1992. A younger Elias stood in uniform beside 3 black soldiers, all 4 facing the memorial with solemn expressions, but the caption beneath the archived image read, 214th Fuel Logistics Unit Ceremonial Representatives. Lena frowned. Wrong. The patch on Elias's younger sleeve was unmistakable. It belonged to the 214th Support Battalion, not Fuel Logistics. The same unit from the missing names. Someone had altered not only the stone, they had altered the historical captions too. This was systemic. At the Savannah Herald, Claire dug through old civilian complaint records and found something equally troubling. Officer Cole Mercer's name surfaced in 3 prior neighborhood stops involving vague phrases like suspicious lingering, repeated loitering, and public observation of protected property. None had led to charges. None had led to discipline. Each had quietly disappeared. Her instincts sharpened. This wasn't an isolated misunderstanding. It was a pattern of weaponized suspicion, By evening, Noah had finished his delivery route and pedaled hard toward the narrow brick house where his grandmother lived near the edge of Liberty Square. Helen Price opened the front door before he even knocked twice. Helen was a 72-year-old African-American widow, short and slender with warm brown skin softened by age and silver curls tucked beneath a pale blue scarf. Her face carried gentle wrinkles around kind, dark eyes, but grief had deepened them over the years. Her late husband, Robert Price, had served in Vietnam and spent the last decade of his life warning her that cities often polished monuments better than they honored the men behind them. That lesson had stayed with her. Noah stepped inside, breathless. "Grandma, that old man at the memorial, they took his notebook." Helen's expression sharpened. "The veteran?" Noah nodded. "He doesn't seem bad, he just keeps touching the same missing names." Helen turned instinctively toward the small monitor mounted beside her kitchen doorway. Her doorbell security camera feed displayed a wide-angle view of the front sidewalk and part of Liberty Square's eastern entrance. From her doorway, the monument had always been partially visible. Today, the camera had likely captured everything. Her eyes lingered on the frozen thumbnail image. Police cruiser. Crowd? The old soldier. A notebook in plastic. For the first time, Helen leaned closer to the screen not as a homeowner, but as a witness. Late that night, the station finally released Elias. No charges, no apology, no notebook. The cold Savannah air greeted him as he returned to the Magnolia Rest Inn, exhaustion hidden beneath military stillness. In the quiet of his room, he removed his coat, lined his boots beside the bed, and sat at the narrow desk. Then, from the bottom drawer of his suitcase, he withdrew a second leather notebook. Older, softer, a twin prepared for the possibility of loss. He opened it to the first blank page and began writing from memory. 11:17 a.m., Liberty Square. Sergeant Hurst authorized unlawful seizure of memorial record notes. Notebook taken as evidence without stated probable cause. Missing names remain absent. Witnesses present. His pen paused only once. Then he wrote the names again. Terrence Hall, Maurice Green, Leon Bishop. The stone had forgotten them. The city had taken the paper. So tonight Elias rebuilt the memorial by hand, one name at a time. 3 mornings later, Savannah carried the kind of cold that seemed to rise from stone instead of sky. A pale silver dawn washed over Liberty Square, and the marble steps of the war memorial held the night's chill like old bones storing memory. Fallen oak leaves skittered across the plaza in the wind, brushing against the bronze boots of the soldier statues. The city was quieter than usual, as if the square itself remembered what had happened there 3 days before. Elias Carter returned anyway. He came earlier than before the tourist carriages and cafe chatter, before suspicion had time to gather faces around him. His weathered brown coat was buttoned high against the wind, and the second leather notebook rested inside his inner pocket, heavier today because it no longer held only names. Now it carried a timeline. Times, officer names, badge numbers, witness positions. The exact minute Sergeant Hurst had ordered the seizure of his first memorial journal. Beside him walked Reverend Marcus Hill. Marcus Hill was a 71-year-old African-American pastor and retired Army chaplain, tall and broad even in old age, with deep mahogany skin, silver hair cropped close around a dignified crown, and a full gray beard trimmed with the discipline of a man who had once served under strict military codes. His shoulders were still powerful beneath a charcoal overcoat, but it was his eyes that defined him, dark, compassionate, and deeply steady, the eyes of a man who had buried too many soldiers and learned how to carry grief without letting it destroy kindness. During his years overseas as a chaplain in Desert Storm, he had met Elias briefly in a field triage tent after the convoy ambush that changed both their lives. Since then, Marcus had built his ministry around one conviction: memory is a form of justice. Today, he had agreed to come as both witness and brother. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked as they crossed the square. Elias nodded. "The petition goes out tomorrow. I need the final alignment of the names before City Council receives it." Marcus glanced at the eastern wall, where the missing section cut through the granite order like a wound. Then let's finish what they tried to interrupt. The two old veterans climbed the marble steps together. The stone was colder than it looked, slick with morning dew, and when Elias reached out to steady himself against the lowest riser, his aged hand touched the freezing surface, rough skin meeting polished stone. The sensation jolted a memory through him, not fear, but recognition. This was the same cold surface his face had nearly met when Mercer's fingers had ripped away the first notebook. Today, he would not stand alone. Elias lifted the camera and began photographing the spacing around Leon Bishop's missing line. Marcus stood beside him, phone already in hand, pretending to check emails but ready to record anything that felt wrong. Across the street, behind lace curtains in her narrow brick house, Helen Price was already awake. She had not slept well since Noah told her what happened. The doorbell security monitor on her kitchen counter now displayed the familiar angle of Liberty Square's eastern entrance, the war memorial framed in the edge of the screen. Helen stood with a mug of tea warming her hands, silver curls tucked beneath a pale scarf, watching the old soldier and the reverend move carefully around the monument. The sight stirred something old and aching inside her. Her late husband, Robert Price, had once stood before another memorial in Atlanta with the same posture. Back straight, hands trembling only after the names had been read aloud. Vietnam had never truly left him, and Helen had spent decades learning that some men did not return from war in bodies alone. They returned in rituals, in silence, in repeated visits to stone names that felt more alive than the living. Now, watching Elias, she recognized the same devotion. Then, a dark sedan rolled up hard against the curb. Her breath caught. Officer Mercer. He came alone. Cole Mercer stepped out of the cruiser with a stiffness in his shoulders that looked less like duty and more like unfinished anger. The last 3 days had not sat well with him. Claire Bennett's quiet questions to the precinct, whispers of witnesses in the square, and Riley's increasingly hesitant silences had all fed a dangerous pressure inside him, the kind that made men mistake control for self-preservation. His gray eyes locked on Elias immediately. "Unbelievable," he muttered. Before approaching, Mercer reached casually toward his chest. With one practiced motion, he switched off his body camera. The small red light died. From her kitchen monitor, Helen leaned closer. Unable to hear, but seeing enough to know something deliberate had just happened. At the memorial, Marcus noticed Mercer's arrival first. His hand tightened around his phone. Elias turned slowly, face calm. Mercer climbed the steps alone, boots striking marble with hard authority. "I thought we made this clear, Mr. Carter." Elias kept the camera lowered at his side. "I'm on public property." Mercer's jaw flexed. "This section of the memorial is under restricted review after recent security concerns." Marcus frowned. "Restricted by what order?" Mercer ignored him completely. His focus stayed on Elias and the notebook bulging faintly inside the coat. "I need the camera and the journal." Elias's voice remained measured, military calm wrapped around every syllable, "not without a lawful order." The air changed. Marcus knew it before the movement came. So did Helen. So did Noah Price, who had just turned the corner on his bike route and stopped cold at the sight of Mercer on the memorial steps. For Noah, this was the first moment childhood certainty cracked. Adults were supposed to know the difference between danger and grief. Mercer lunged. His hand grabbed the camera strap and yanked hard. The compact camera slammed against Elias's chest, twisting the older man sideways. Marcus's phone was up instantly, the recording screen trembling because his hand was shaking. Not from fear alone, but from the terrible recognition of history repeating itself. "Cole, stop!" Marcus shouted, but Mercer was already driving forward. He shoved Elias hard. The old veteran lost footing on the dew-slick marble, his boots sliding out beneath him. He crashed forward, shoulder first, then both hands striking the ice-cold stone steps. For one suspended second, the entire chapter of his life seemed to collapse into that contact. the freezing marble, the shock in his wrists, the sting in the right side of his cheek. The humiliation of old bones meeting public stone. His left palm scraped across the step, skin splitting slightly at the heel of the hand. Marcus's voice broke as he kept filming. "Don't touch him again!" But Mercer dropped a knee beside Elias, forcing one arm behind his back. "You are resisting an active safety order," Mercer snapped. "I am not resisting," Elias said through clenched control. Every word remained steady. That calmness only made Mercer angrier. The handcuffs clicked shut around Elias's wrists. From her kitchen, Helen stared at the monitor with tears blurring her vision. Not because of Elias alone, but because the image overlaid itself with Robert kneeling on their bedroom floor years ago. Shaking after a fireworks display had sent him back into jungle memories. The city never learns, she thought. Marcus lowered to one knee, still filming, his breathing uneven, but determined. His years as a chaplain had taught him that courage did not always look fearless. Sometimes it looked like a trembling hand that refused to lower the phone. Across the square, Noah stood frozen beside his bike, the cracked phone in his hoodie recording in silence. For the first time in his 14 years, injustice stopped being something adults talked about on the news. Now it had weight, a sound, a face, an old man on stone. At the precinct across town, Riley Shaw's radio crackled from the dispatch desk. "Officer Mercer requesting transport support. One detained male, repeat suspicious presence, restricted monument zone violation." Riley's stomach dropped. Repeat. Mercer again. She stared at the uniform folded neatly over the back of her chair, and for the first time since graduating the academy, the badge felt heavier than pride. It felt dangerous. She imagined Elias's veteran pin, the missing names, the way Mercer had stepped too close days earlier, and suddenly Riley felt something she had never expected to feel toward the profession she once admired. Fear, not of the streets, of the uniform itself. Back at Liberty Square, Mercer hauled Elias to his feet and marched him down the steps while Marcus kept filming every second. Claire Bennett's phone buzzed. A video file. Sender, Marcus Hill. The thumbnail showed Elias on the stone. Her pulse surged. She opened it, watched only 5 seconds, and immediately locked the screen. Not yet. This needed verification, witnesses, angles, timestamps. If released too early, the city would dismiss it as selective outrage. No, this had to land with proof. At the memorial, Mercer pushed Elias toward the cruiser. The second notebook remained inside the coat, untouched. For now. And as the patrol car door slammed shut, Liberty Square was no longer merely the place where names had been erased. It had become the place where truth had finally found a lens. By midnight, Savannah had gone quiet under a curtain of cold rain, the streets around the precinct reflecting red traffic lights in long, trembling lines. Inside the holding floor, the Savannah Central Precinct, fluorescent lights hummed with the same indifferent chill as the marble steps Elias Carter had struck that morning. He sat alone in a temporary detention room, wrists free now, but marked by faint red lines where the cuffs had bitten into old skin. His coat had been taken for inventory, his second notebook logged as personal property, and his compact camera sat on a metal processing tray outside the room. What troubled him most was not the bruising in his shoulder. It was the silence around the camera. Because he knew what mattered most inside, it was not the device. It was the memory card. At the evidence desk, a technician slid the camera across to a fresh pair of hands. Those hands belonged to Officer Jenna Pike. Jenna was a 33-year-old white female officer, tall and narrow-framed with pale freckled skin, auburn hair tied in a tight regulation knot, and sharp amber eyes that moved with the efficiency of someone who trusted paperwork more than people. Her expression was habitually flat, but beneath it lived the defensive pragmatism of an officer who had built her career by protecting the version of events most likely to survive internal review. Years earlier, during her rookie year, a truthful report had nearly cost her field placement when it contradicted a senior sergeant. Since then, Jenna had learned the institutional lesson too many survive by. Accuracy matters less than alignment. She picked up the camera, opened the side slot, and carefully removed the memory card. The tiny black chip disappeared into a separate evidence envelope marked Pending Digital Review. Then she turned to the report terminal and began typing. Subject advanced toward Officer Mercer twice during verbal de-escalation attempt. Subject made aggressive upper body contact requiring restraint. Every sentence was precise. Every sentence was false. Down the hall, Elias sat upright on the narrow bench, back straight against cinder block, breathing in the same slow military rhythm that had carried him through desert bombardments and casualty triage. He could not see the report being written, but instinct told him the story outside the room was already changing shape. Across town, however, a different story was assembling. At Vanessa Cole's law office, lights still burned past midnight. Vanessa Cole was a 39-year-old African-American civil rights attorney, tall, elegant, and razor-focused, with rich brown skin, a lean athletic build, and sharp, dark eyes behind thin, gold-rimmed glasses. Her black hair fell in smooth, shoulder-length waves, always immaculate no matter the hour. She spoke quickly, thought faster, and had built a reputation in Georgia for dismantling institutional lies with surgical precision. Her father, once wrongfully profiled in a traffic stop that escalated into violence, had shaped her career long before law school ever did. Since then, Vanessa had made it her life's work to challenge the quiet bureaucracies of injustice. Tonight, she stood over a conference table layered with devices, transcripts, and printouts. Claire Bennett sat on one side, coat still damp from rain. Lena Brooks sat opposite her with museum files stacked in neat, chronological order. Reverend Marcus Hill remained standing, phone in hand, replaying the video of Elias on the stone. Vanessa looked up sharply. "We don't have a story yet." Claire frowned. "We have a man slammed on camera." Vanessa nodded. "That's outrage. Outrage fades. We need structure." She began assigning evidence like battlefield positions. "Marcus, your video gives us the physical assault. Helen's doorbell footage gives us angle confirmation and proves Mercer arrived alone. Claire, I need every dispatch log around Liberty Square for the last 18 months involving suspicious presence." Lena traced the Memorial Restoration Board from 1998 through the Veterans Committees. The room moved instantly. This was no longer a reaction. It was a case. At the Savannah Herald, Claire's phone rang just as she uploaded the first still frame from Marcus's video. Her editor, Thomas Reeve, did not bother with pleasantries. Thomas was a 58-year-old white newsroom editor, broad-faced with graying hair, reading glasses permanently low on his nose, and the weary caution of a man who had spent decades balancing truth against the politics of advertisers in City Hall. He believed in journalism, but years of lawsuits and sponsor pressure had taught him the cost of stories that moved too fast. "Claire," he said, voice low, "don't post that video yet." Her jaw tightened. "It's real." "I know, it's real. But if we lead with assault before verifying the veteran's background, they'll bury us under context." She looked at the paused image of Elias face down on the memorial step. "They already buried the context." Silence. Then Thomas exhaled. "Bring me something bigger than one bad cop." Claire ended the call with frustration burning hot behind her ribs. For the first time in her career, she understood that publishing the truth and proving the truth were not the same battle. At the museum archives, Lena's own battle had turned inward. The Restoration Board records had finally led her to an old city memorandum signed by 5 committee members in 1998. One name froze her breath. Samuel Brooks, her father, a former city records administrator, a man who had taught her to respect the sanctity of history. Her hands trembled as she opened the attached minutes. There it was in careful municipal language. Name standardization approved to preserve visual symmetry of memorial panels. Non-priority service records removed pending later verification. Non-priority. The phrase hit like betrayal. Those were the black soldiers. Her father had not physically carved away the names, but he had signed the silence that allowed it. Lena sat back in the chair, grief and disbelief colliding inside her chest. The injustice around Elias was no longer abstract civic corruption. It was braided into her own family history. At Helen Price's house, Noah sat at the kitchen table while his grandmother replayed the doorbell footage frame by frame. The boy's freckled face looked older tonight, less curious, more resolved. He pulled out his cracked phone and opened the grainy photo he had taken 3 mornings earlier, the first time Mercer had stepped into Elias's space. In the image, the angle clearly showed Mercer crowding Elias while the veteran stood still with both hands visible. Noah swallowed. This matters, doesn't it? Helen looked at him, soft but serious. Sometimes the truth survives because someone young decides to keep looking. Noah stood up, crossed the room, and handed the phone to Claire when she arrived 20 minutes later. In that moment, he stopped being just a witness. He became evidence. By dawn, the pieces had begun locking together. Claire's dispatch log review revealed 23 suspicious person calls tied to Liberty Square in 2 years, almost all involving black veterans, elderly black men, or visitors carrying notebooks and cameras. Lena's archival sweep confirmed that 5 black veterans' names had been removed from city memorial records under vague panel consistency language. Marcus's video proved Mercer had escalated physical force. Helen's doorbell footage confirmed the body camera light had gone dark before the assault. Noah's photo established the pattern began days earlier. And then Vanessa opened the final military folder Lena had recovered from Federal Cross-Reference Archives. The room went silent. Inside was the original Kuwait convoy rescue citation. Staff Sergeant Elias Carter had driven an armored supply vehicle back into artillery fire after receiving orders to retreat, rescuing 7 trapped soldiers from a disabled convoy carrier. The commendation recommendation was signed, then struck through, reissued weeks later under another officer's name. Claire stared. They stole his rescue. Vanessa's voice dropped lower. And now the Department of Veterans Affairs is reviewing the case for national restoration. Lena looked up, stunned. The ceremony location? Savannah, Vanessa finished. Liberty Square. Veterans Day weekend. The room fell into a different kind of silence. The city had planned to honor Elias Carter in public within days. The same city that had twice humiliated him before the memorial where his men's names had already been erased. At sunrise, Vanessa arrived at the precinct with a release petition, federal correspondence, and enough evidence to make delay dangerous. Elias stepped out into the rain-washed morning, coat returned, bruised but upright. Claire waited beneath an umbrella. Marcus stood beside her. Lena clutched the military file. Vanessa handed Elias the folder without ceremony. He opened it slowly. There, in formal Department of Veterans Affairs language, was the truth he had carried in silence for decades. Recommendation for National Distinguished Valor Restoration, Elias Carter. The city had not just arrested an old veteran, it had laid hands on the man it was about to celebrate as a war hero, and for the first time, Savannah's polished memorials, careful headlines, and bureaucratic edits began to tremble beneath the weight of what was coming. Veterans Day week arrived beneath a clear Savannah sky, the kind of bright blue that made every flag over Liberty Square look sharper, prouder, and more accusing. The city had begun dressing itself for ceremony. Banners hung from lampposts along the historic district. Storefront windows displayed folded flags and gold ribbon wreaths. At the memorial itself, maintenance crews polished bronze plaques and pressure-washed the marble steps as if stone could be cleaned faster than memory. By late morning, the tension in Savannah no longer lived in whispers. It moved in glances, half-finished headlines, and the nervous silence of institutions waiting to see which truth would survive noon. At the Savannah Herald studio, Claire Bennett stood beneath the wash of broadcast lights, every page of her script marked with handwritten edits. This was no longer the dry preservation budget story Thomas Reeve had assigned her days ago. It had become the largest investigation of her career, the kind of story that could either make a journalist or bury one beneath political retaliation. Thomas stood in the control booth above, broad face set in grim concentration. He had finally seen enough. The full timeline, the memorial footage, the altered military records, the city restoration minutes, the State Valor Restoration Notice. Now his caution had shifted into something colder and cleaner. Resolve. Claire adjusted the earpiece as the countdown began. 5, 4, 3. The red light blinked on. Good afternoon, Savannah. This is Claire Bennett with a special Veterans Week investigative report. Her voice carried across studio speakers and into homes, cafes, city offices, patrol rooms, and hospital waiting lounges all over Georgia. The first image appeared behind her. Elias Carter, face down on the marble steps of Liberty Square War Memorial. The city froze. At Savannah Central Precinct, Officer Cole Mercer sat in the break room with stale coffee in one hand, half listening to the mounted television above the vending machines. He had spent the morning convincing himself the department would handle things quietly. Internal review would drag. Witnesses would blur details. The city would prioritize the ceremony over scandal. Then the screen changed. The first 5 seconds of Reverend Marcus Hill's video played in full resolution. Mercer watched himself step into frame, watched his own hand grab the camera strap, watched Elias fall, his face drained of color. For the first time since this began, certainty abandoned him. The veteran's name appeared in bold beneath the footage. Staff Sergeant Elias Carter, Valor Restoration Honoree. The coffee cup slipped slightly in Mercer's hand, dark liquid spilling across his knuckles. In the bullpen outside, conversation stopped. Every officer now stared at the same screen. Claire continued, calm and mercilessly precise. Our investigation confirms that Officer Mercer's body camera was manually deactivated seconds before physical contact occurred. Behind her, a still frame from Helen Price's doorbell camera appeared, clearly showing the body cam light go dark. Then came the second slide, a citywide data map. Red markers clustered around Liberty Square and adjacent historic blocks. Dispatch records from the past 24 months show 23 suspicious person calls tied to this district. 21 involved black male visitors, including 4 veterans. The weight of that statistic moved through the city like thunder. At a downtown diner, forks paused above plates. At City Hall, aides turned toward muted office televisions. At the museum, interns stared open-mouthed at Lena Brooks's research being cited live. Claire delivered the next line with deliberate force. The pattern is not random. It reflects a sustained institutional suspicion disproportionately directed at black residents and veterans in public memorial spaces. At the precinct records office, Riley Shaw stood alone with a witness affidavit form on the counter. Her hands were trembling. Not from doubt. From consequence. Riley was still young enough to know that truth could end a career before it ever truly began. The academy had taught procedure, law, and ethics in clean paragraphs. The streets had taught her hierarchy, silence, and the cost of crossing senior officers. But Elias's face on the stone had changed something in her. The image would not leave her, neither would the veteran's pin. Her pen hovered above the final line. Then, despite the visible tremor in her fingers, she signed. Officer Riley Shaw, witness statement confirming Officer Mercer initiated physical escalation after deactivating body camera. The moment the ink dried, fear and relief collided in her chest. For the first time, she felt she was wearing the uniform for the right reason. Back in the studio, Claire moved to the largest revelation. The military citation file filled the screen behind her. This station has confirmed through Department of Veterans Affairs records that Elias Carter is the pending recipient of the Georgia Distinguished Valor Medal, recognizing his rescue of 7 soldiers under artillery fire in Kuwait, a commendation that had been wrongly credited to another officer for more than 30 years. Across Savannah, the effect was immediate. The city was no longer watching a police misconduct story. It was watching itself be exposed. At the museum press room, Lena Brooks stepped before a bank of microphones beside a display easel holding the original 1998 restoration minutes. Her slim figure looked smaller than the gravity of what she carried, but her voice held steady. "These are the original municipal restoration records," she said, lifting the folder slightly. "They prove that 3 names, Terrence Hall, Maurice Green, and Leon Bishop, were removed from Liberty Square under language described as panel symmetry correction." She paused, grief flickering behind professional composure. "My father signed one of these documents." The room shifted. No one had expected personal accountability. Lena continued anyway. Silence preserved this lie longer than stone did. At Liberty Square itself, reporters gathered near Helen Price's front gate. Helen stepped onto the small brick walkway with the posture of a woman who had spent decades watching history happen through windows. Today, she chose the doorway. The elderly widow stood wrapped in a navy shawl, silver curls tucked beneath her scarf, dark eyes steady beneath age-lined brows. A young reporter asked, "Mrs. Price, why speak now?" Helen looked toward the memorial visible over the hedges. "Because I stayed quiet when my husband came home from Vietnam and the city forgot men like him, too." Her voice was soft, but every syllable carried like a bell. "I have been silent long enough to know silence always helps the wrong people." Her words traveled across afternoon broadcasts within minutes. They landed not as commentary, but as indictment. The voice of a generation that had watched too much disappear politely. At the far edge of the growing crowd, Noah Price stood with his bike beside him, eyes fixed on the giant outdoor news screen mounted above a pharmacy across the square. He was still just 14, hoodie zipped high against the wind, sandy hair pushed messily from his forehead. But today, something in his face had changed. He no longer looked like a boy trying to understand adults. He looked like someone watching a system crack. When Claire's report displayed his photo from the first stop, showing Mercer crowding Elias while the veteran's hands remained visible, Noah felt a strange stillness settle inside him. The adults had lied. But the lie had not lasted. For the first time, he understood that evidence gave truth endurance. By 2 p.m., the collapse inside city institutions had begun. At precinct headquarters, internal affairs officers escorted Jenna Pike from records review after flagging the false supplemental report. Her sharp amber eyes, usually unreadable, now flickered with panic as the typed line about Elias advancing twice was held against Helen's footage and Marcus's video. Down the hall, Sergeant Daniel Hurst was informed of immediate reassignment pending supervisory review. Cole Mercer was called to the chief's office and emerged 20 minutes later without badge or service sidearm. Immediate suspension without pay. By evening, the Savannah City Memorial Council released an emergency statement acknowledging that Liberty Square had undergone historical modifications inconsistent with complete service record integrity. It was the most bureaucratic way possible to admit what the city had done. They had edited heroism by race. As the sun lowered over the square, the air itself felt different. Not healed, but shifting. Beneath the flags, crews quietly removed the decorative black cloth covering the eastern panel, preparing it for emergency restoration review. The marble steps where Elias had fallen remained visible in the amber light, no longer just a site of humiliation. Now they had become evidence. And everywhere in Savannah, from newsroom desks to church pews, from police lockers to school buses, the same understanding spread. The city had not merely mistreated an old black veteran. It had humiliated the very man it was preparing to honor. The lie had finally reached noon, and it had not survived the light. 1 month later, Savannah no longer looked like a city hiding from its own reflection. The first Saturday of December arrived beneath a golden winter sky, clear and crisp, with sunlight pouring through the Spanish moss like soft fire. Liberty Square War Memorial stood transformed. The marble had been fully restored, the bronze figures polished to a warm glow, and the eastern granite panel, once scarred by absence, now carried every name in perfect alignment. Freshly engraved letters caught the morning light, sharp and permanent, no longer vulnerable to bureaucratic silence. By 10 o'clock, the square was full. American flags lined the walkways. A military band in navy dress uniforms stood near the fountain, brass instruments glinting beneath the sun. School children from 3 Savannah high schools held white roses in neat bundles. Veterans in caps and decorated jackets filled the front rows, some standing with canes, some in wheelchairs, all facing the memorial with the solemn stillness of men and women who understood what names on stone truly cost. At the center of it all stood Elias Carter. He wore an old charcoal suit that had clearly been pressed with military precision, every crease straight, every button aligned. The suit itself was not expensive, but it carried the dignity of a man who had learned long ago that honor does not need luxury. His silver-gray hair was trimmed close, his shoulders straight despite the bruise that had only recently faded beneath the coat line, and his dark eyes moved slowly over the restored names with a calm so deep it almost looked like peace. For the first time since arriving in Savannah, Elias no longer stood before the monument as a suspect. He stood before it as history returned. Beside the podium, the mayor of Savannah, Rebecca Langford, stepped forward. Rebecca was a 61-year-old white woman, tall and stately with fair skin, silver blonde hair styled in a smooth, shoulder-length wave, and the composed authority of someone long practiced in public responsibility. Her voice had once made her a beloved civil rights attorney before politics drew her into city leadership. The scandal around Liberty Square had shaken her deeply, not because it threatened her office, but because it revealed how easily institutions she trusted had preserved injustice beneath polished ceremony. Today, she carried no defensive tone, only accountability. "Mr. Elias Carter," she began, her voice amplified across the square. "On behalf of the city of Savannah, I offer a public apology long overdue." A silence moved through the crowd. No whispers, no camera shutters, just listening. "This city failed you. Worse, it failed the men who stood beside you in service and whose names should never have been removed from the story of their sacrifice." Behind her, the newly restored eastern panel gleamed. Terrence Hall, Maurice Green, Leon Bishop. The names now stood where they had always belonged. Mayor Langford continued. "Today, we are establishing the Forgotten Valor Scholarship Fund, named in honor of the restored soldiers of Liberty Square, to support the education of children from military families whose histories deserve preservation, not erasure." The applause that followed was not loud at first. It was reverent. Then it grew. A city finally learning how to clap for truth. Near the front row, Claire Bennett lowered her pen for the first time in days. Her second published piece, released that morning in the Savannah Herald, was not an investigation. It was a long-form feature titled "Healing the Names We Tried to Forget." A story about memory, accountability, and the quiet courage of communities willing to repair what they once ignored. The article had already been nominated for a regional journalism award, but that mattered less to Claire than what she saw now, not exposure, but healing. A few feet away, Lena Brooks stood beside a portable display board showcasing the launch of the Savannah Veterans Digital Archive Initiative, the preservation project she had spent the last month building. Her dark eyes moved from the memorial to the students gathered nearby, and for the first time since discovering her father's signature on the old city records, the grief inside her had found purpose. History had wounded her family. Now, it would be repaired through her hands. At the edge of the veterans section, Helen Price stepped carefully toward the base of the memorial, a bouquet of white lilies in her arms. The elderly widow wore a navy coat and pale scarf, silver curls glowing softly in the winter sun. She bent slowly, placing the flowers at the foot of the eastern wall. "For Robert," she whispered. Then, after a pause, her fingertips brushing the marble, she added, "And for every name they thought time would hide." The lilies rested beneath the restored names like a final blessing from the generation that had waited too long to be heard. When the ceremony announcer called for the presentation of the Georgia Distinguished Valor Medal, the band shifted into a slow brass arrangement of America the Beautiful. Elias stepped forward. The medal ribbon, deep blue edged in gold, was placed around his neck as the crowd rose to its feet. Not because the program told them to, because the city understood what standing meant now. After the applause softened, Elias approached the microphone. He looked out over the crowd. Students, reporters, veterans, city officials, Riley Shaw in her dress uniform near the side aisle, Noah beside his bicycle helmet and school jacket, Helen, Claire, Lena, Marcus Hill, and even strangers whose faces had once held suspicion. His speech was short, but every word landed. "I came here for 3 names," Elias said, voice low and steady. "I never came here for mine." The square fell completely silent. These men were brave before anyone wrote it down. They were honorable before a city admitted it. And they mattered before Stone remembered. He glanced back at the restored wall. History is not repaired when one man is honored. It is repaired when every name is returned to the light. There were tears in more faces than anyone expected, not because the words were dramatic, because they were true. Near the stage steps, Riley Shaw stood straighter than she had in weeks. She had officially filed her transfer request to the Community Relations and Veteran Outreach Division the day after testifying. The old fear she'd once felt toward her uniform had not vanished, but it had transformed into responsibility. As Elias stepped away from the podium, Riley raised her hand in a formal military salute. Perfect posture, precise angle, no hesitation. For one heartbeat, Elias looked almost surprised. Then the old soldier returned the salute. The crowd erupted again. Not in noise, in emotion. By late afternoon, the official ceremony gave way to smaller moments. Claire interviewed veterans about the scholarship fund. Lena scanned donated letters for the digital archive. Helen remained seated near the lilies, watching the names glow under the sinking sun. And near the memorial steps, Noah waited awkwardly with both hands shoved into his hoodie pocket. Elias approached him holding a small object wrapped in brown paper. "For you." Noah opened it carefully. Inside was a new leather notebook, smooth, dark, and empty. The boy looked up, blue eyes wide. Elias smiled faintly. "Don't just look at monuments," he said. "Learn how to read the names." Noah held the notebook against his chest as if it were heavier than paper, because it was. It was responsibility, possibility, the first page of the life he now wanted. For weeks he had thought about Claire's courage, Lena's archives, Helen's witness, and Elias's refusal to let silence win. Standing there now, he understood what he wanted to become. Maybe a journalist, maybe a historian, maybe simply the kind of man who noticed what others tried not to see. As the sun lowered into a deep amber horizon, the restored names on the eastern wall caught the final light of day. Gold. Warm. Undeniable. Elias stepped closer one last time. His fingertips found Leon Bishop's name, the one that had once been absent beneath cold stone and political convenience. Now it stood sharp beneath his touch. The military band, almost instinctively, began a final closing note. Around him, the entire square rose once more. Veterans first, then students, then city officials, then everyone else. A full standing salute, not to ceremony, not to politics, to the recognition they had owed him for decades. Elias looked across the faces of Savannah and, for the first time in many years, allowed himself to believe he would stay. Not as a visitor, but as an advisor to Lena's archive project, a guardian of restored memory, and the quiet witness this city would need if it ever forgot again. The sun dipped lower. The engraved names held the light, and where erasure once lived, history now stood whole. Some of the deepest wounds in life are not caused by what people say openly, but by what they choose not to see. Elias Carter's story reminds us that injustice often begins in ordinary moments. A glance that turns into suspicion. A silence that allows the wrong story to survive. A system that values appearance over truth. In our daily lives, we may never stand before a war memorial, but we all stand before people every day. A neighbor, a stranger, an elderly veteran, a worker, a child, someone who looks different from us or carries a pain we cannot immediately understand. The lesson is simple and powerful. Never decide who someone is before you take the time to truly see them. This story also teaches us that history matters. Families, schools, communities, and nations are only as strong as the truths they are willing to preserve. When names are erased, when contributions are ignored, or when people are judged by race, age, or appearance, society loses a part of its own soul. Education begins when we learn to honor every story fairly and teach the next generation to ask questions instead of repeating prejudice. A gentle challenge for all of us is this: in everyday life, choose patience over assumption, listening over judgment, and courage over silence. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is speak up for someone whose voice has been overlooked. Sometimes healing begins with one person refusing to look away. My honest reflection on this story is that its greatest strength is not only the emotional justice for Elias, but the reminder that true honor is not in ceremonies alone. It is in how we treat people when we think no one is watching. That is the real test of character, both for individuals and for society. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who believes dignity should never depend on skin color, status, or age. Let us know in the comments what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you believe every forgotten name deserves to be brought back into the light, please comment Amen, so this message of justice, memory, and healing can reach more hearts. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing stories that change lives. May God bless every person watching today. May He protect your family, strengthen your heart, and help all of us become people who choose truth, compassion, and courage in everyday life. Amen.